Tonight, we're diving into the story of a substance that was once hailed as medicine's greatest achievement, a cure for coughs, for pain, for the very suffering of existence itself. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world. Let's begin. In the fertile crescent of human civilization, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, where the first cities rose from dust and ambition, there grew a flower. Not a rose, not a lily, but something far more consequential. A poppy. Its petals were delicate, ranging from white to deep purple, and when they fell, they left behind a bulbous seed pod. If you knew what you were doing, if the knowledge had been passed down to you through generations, you would take a small knife at dusk and score that pod with shallow cuts. By morning, a milky latex would have wept from those wounds, oxidizing in the air to a dark brown resin. This was opium, and it is perhaps the oldest drug known to humanity. The Sumerians, 5,000 years before the birth of Christ, called it hulgil, the joy plant. It appears in their cuneiform tablets, prescribed for ailments, offered to gods. The ancient Egyptians cultivated it in their gardens. Papyrus scrolls from Thebes list it among hundreds of medicinal compounds. The Greeks knew it well. Homer in the Odyssey describes a potion, nepenthe, given to Helen of Troy to wash away sorrow and anger, to make one forget all pain. Scholars believe this was opium dissolved in wine. The great physician Galen, whose medical texts would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years, used it liberally. He understood its power to kill pain, to induce sleep, to quiet the mind. But opium was not just medicine. It was pleasure. It was escape. The Romans consumed it. The Persians traded it. The Arab physicians of the medieval Islamic Golden Age, the true inheritors of Greek medical knowledge, refined its use. They created theriac, a complex preparation containing opium, believed to be a cure-all, a protection against poison and plague. When the Crusaders returned to Europe, blooded and broken, they brought with them not just tales of holy war, but also an appreciation for the poppy's gift. For millennia, opium remained what it had always been, a plant product, a resin, consumed by eating, drinking in solution, or smoking. Its effects were profound but limited by the form. You could not easily overdose on crude opium. The body rejected it before lethal doses were reached. But all of this would change, because in the fervour of the 19th century, an age intoxicated by the power of science, men in laboratories began to take the natural world apart, compound by compound, seeking to isolate the essence of things. The breakthrough came in 1804, in a small pharmacy in the German town of Paderborn. A young apprentice pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner was conducting experiments. He was obsessed with the idea that opium's effects must be caused by a single, isolable substance, not the complex mixture of plant matter. Using a careful process of extraction with ammonia and acid, he managed to crystallize a white powder from opium. When he tested it on himself and on 3 friends, the results were extraordinary. Even in minute quantities, it produced profound sleep and pain relief, but it was also terrifyingly potent. All 4 men became violently ill, vomiting and disoriented for days. Serturner had isolated the principal alkaloid of opium, and he named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. For the first time in human history, pain could be reliably, completely eliminated. Morphine was a revolution. By the 1820s it was being produced commercially. By the 1850s, with the invention of the hypodermic syringe, it could be injected directly into the bloodstream, delivering instant, overwhelming relief. It was a miracle. It was used everywhere, for everything. Battlefield surgeons in the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, carried it as their most precious tool. They could amputate limbs, extract bullets, and operate on conscious men who felt nothing. It was given to women in childbirth, to children with coughs, to anyone suffering from dysentery, tuberculosis, or simple melancholy. Patent medicines, sold over the counter with no regulation, were loaded with it. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup marketed for teething babies was essentially morphine in sugar water. The Victorian medicine cabinet was a pharmacopoeia of opiates. But the miracle had a shadow. Doctors began to notice a disturbing pattern. Patients who had been given morphine for pain did not want to stop taking it. Soldiers who had been treated for wounds during the war came home and continued to seek it out, not for pain, but for the feeling it gave them, the warm, enveloping embrace that made the world bearable. They called it the soldier's disease, this new affliction, this dependence. The miracle cure had created a class of the afflicted, morphine addicts. The medical establishment was alarmed but not deterred. The solution, they believed, was not to abandon opiates but to find a better opiate, one that was more powerful for pain but somehow less addictive, one that could cure the morphine addict without creating a new problem. It was a naive, almost childlike faith in chemistry's ability to engineer perfection. And so the search began. In the clean, ordered laboratories of late 19th century Europe, chemists were playing God with molecules. They had learned to take morphine and modify it, adding atoms here, removing them there, creating new compounds with subtly different effects. One such chemist was a man named Charles Romley Alder Wright, working at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School in London. In 1874, he took morphine and boiled it with a chemical called acetic anhydride. The result was a new substance, a semi-synthetic opioid, diacetyl morphine. Wright tested it on dogs. They became lethargic, their pupils pinpoint, their breathing depressed. He noted the results in his lab journal and moved on. The compound was, for the moment, forgotten. Just another derivative in a sea of experiments, but nothing stays buried forever. 23 years later, in 1897, another chemist would rediscover Wright's forgotten molecule and give it to the world, not as a curiosity, but as a product. His name was Felix Hoffmann, and he worked for a German pharmaceutical giant, Bayer. The company was under pressure. Their chemists were synthesizing new compounds at a furious pace, and management wanted profitable medicines. Hoffmann, in a series of experiments, resynthesized diacetyl morphine. Bayer tested it on animals, then on workers in the factory, then on patients. The reports were glowing. It was more potent than morphine, much more potent. A smaller dose produced a greater effect. But the crucial claim, the one that Bayer's marketing department would seize upon, was that it appeared to be non-addictive. Early test subjects reported none of the craving associated with morphine. It produced euphoria, yes, but also a sense of strength and heroism. And so Bayer gave it a name that reflected this feeling, a name that would echo through the next century with grim irony. They called it heroin. In 1898, Bayer launched a massive international marketing campaign. Heroin was presented as a wonder drug, a cough suppressant far superior to codeine, a treatment for bronchitis, asthma, tuberculosis, and crucially a cure for morphine addiction. The advertising was everywhere. Medical journals, pamphlets sent to doctors, posters in pharmacies. Heroin, the sedative for coughs. Bayer sold it in powder form, in tablets, in lozenges. They sold kits with a small bottle of heroin hydrochloride and a glass syringe. It was marketed to adults, to children, to anyone who coughed. The medical community embraced it. Within a year, heroin was being prescribed by doctors across Europe and America. It was sold over the counter in hundreds of patent medicines. A mother could walk into a pharmacy and buy a bottle of heroin-laced cough syrup for her child, without a prescription, without a question. It was cheaper than morphine, more effective, and according to the company that made a fortune from it, it was safe. For a few brief years, heroin was king. It was the future of medicine. But the future had a short horizon. By 1902, barely 4 years after its launch, the first cracks in the narrative began to appear. Doctors started to report cases of patients who could not stop taking heroin. The same desperate craving that had plagued morphine users was now surfacing in heroin patients. And it was worse. The addiction was faster, more intense, more all-consuming. The euphoria that had been celebrated was a trap. The heroic feeling gave way to a desperate need. By 1913, Bayer had quietly stopped producing heroin. The wonder drug had become an embarrassment. But by then, it was too late. The formula was out. Other pharmaceutical companies had begun producing it, and a new class of user had emerged, not patients following a doctor's orders, but people seeking the feeling itself. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. The response from governments was swift and panicked. In 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, which heavily regulated opiates and cocaine. By the 1920s, heroin was effectively banned for medical use in the United States. European nations followed suit. The League of Nations, in the aftermath of World War I, made international drug control one of its first priorities. By 1925, heroin was illegal to manufacture or import in most of the developed world. But prohibition, as history has shown again and again, does not eliminate desire. It simply drives it underground. Heroin did not disappear, it transformed. What had been a medicine became a contraband, a black market commodity. And where there is demand for a banned substance, there will always be someone willing to supply it. The stage was set for the next act. The transformation of heroin from a pharmaceutical mistake into the fuel for a global criminal empire. The first heroin traffickers were not glamorous. They were opportunists, small-time criminals who saw a chance to make money from a newly forbidden substance. In the 1920s and 30s, most of the world's illicit heroin was manufactured in France and China. In Shanghai, which had become the opium capital of the world under British colonial influence, chemists began producing heroin in clandestine labs. The Chinese triads, ancient secret societies that had devolved into criminal syndicates, saw an opportunity. They controlled the opium dens and the distribution networks. Adding heroin to their portfolio was a natural expansion. But the real transformation came after World War II, and it began with a marriage of convenience between American intelligence and the Sicilian mafia. During the war, the US Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, had collaborated with the mafia to secure the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943. Mob bosses like Lucky Luciano, serving time in American prisons, were offered deals in exchange for using their connections on the island. After the war, many of these mobsters were either released or deported back to Italy, and they brought with them connections, ambition, and an understanding of the American market. In Sicily, the mafia established heroin labs. Morphine base was sourced from opium produced in Turkey and Lebanon, smuggled into Marseille, France, where a network of Corsican gangsters controlled a series of sophisticated laboratories. There, chemists converted the morphine base into pure heroin hydrochloride, the white powder that could be easily cut and distributed. This network became known as the French Connection. The logistics were elegant. Heroin was concealed in everything: false-bottomed suitcases, hollowed-out car parts, shipments of luxury goods. It was smuggled across the Atlantic, arriving in New York, the beating heart of the American underworld. The Italian-American mafia families, particularly the Genovese and the Lucchese families, controlled the distribution. They flooded the streets of New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago with cheap, high-quality heroin. The user base exploded. In the 1950s and 60s, heroin was no longer just a problem for down-and-out drifters. It had invaded the jazz clubs of Harlem, where musicians seeking to touch the sublime found in heroin a shortcut to feeling. Charlie Parker, Billie Holiday, Miles Davis. These were not just users, they were icons, and their use lent heroin a tragic glamour. The drug became associated with artistic genius, with a certain self-destructive authenticity. But heroin was also spreading into poorer neighborhoods, places already marginalized and neglected. In the tenements of the South Bronx, the housing projects of Chicago, heroin became an epidemic. It was cheap, it was available, and it offered an escape from lives that offered little hope. The overdose deaths began to pile up. Families were destroyed. Crime, driven by the desperate need for the next fix, spiraled out of control. The US government, alarmed by the social decay, launched a new offensive. President Nixon, in 1971, declared drug abuse public enemy number one and officially launched the war on drugs. The strategy was two-pronged: crush the supply at its source and incarcerate the users at home. The DEA was born, and American pressure forced Turkey to ban opium cultivation in 1972. The French connection was dismantled through a series of arrests and prosecutions in the early 70s. For a brief moment, it seemed like the war could be won. Heroin purity on American streets plummeted. Prices rose. The epidemic seemed to ebb. But as the Sicilians fell, a new player was waiting in the wings. A player who controlled not labs in Europe, but the very source of the opium poppy itself. A player whose rise to power was not just a story of crime, but of war, geopolitics, and the unintended consequences of empire. That player was the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle is a lawless, mountainous region where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar converge. It is one of the most remote and inaccessible places on Earth, a landscape of steep, jungle-covered hills and hidden valleys where central government authority has never truly reached. It is also, for reasons of geography and politics, one of the world's great opium-producing regions. The hill tribes who lived there, the Hmong, the Shan, the Wa, had cultivated opium poppies for generations. It was a cash crop, one of the few that could survive the harsh conditions and be easily transported on the backs of mules along the narrow mountain trails. But it was the chaos of the mid-20th century that transformed this regional trade into a global industry. After the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, remnants of the nationalist Kuomintang army fled into northern Burma and Laos. These soldiers, abandoned by history, needed a way to survive. They turned to the opium trade, offering protection to the hill tribes in exchange for a cut of the profits. They built refineries, turning raw opium into morphine base and then into heroin. The CIA, engaged in a secret war in Laos against communist forces, turned a blind eye and, according to numerous reports, even provided logistical support to these groups. Anti-communist allies, even if they were drug traffickers, were preferable to a communist victory. By the 1970s, the Golden Triangle was producing hundreds of tons of heroin a year. The most powerful figure to emerge from this chaos was a man named Khun Sa. Born to a Chinese father and a Shan mother, Khun Sa was a warlord, a businessman, and a pragmatist. He commanded a private army of thousands, controlled vast swathes of territory in the Shan state of Myanmar, and at his peak, he was responsible for producing an estimated 70% of the world's heroin supply. His operation was vertically integrated. He taxed the farmers who grew the poppies. He operated the refineries deep in the jungle, protected by his heavily armed soldiers. He controlled the mule caravans that carried the product to the borders. From there, it was smuggled into Thailand, and from Bangkok, it was shipped to markets across Asia, Australia, Europe, and America. Khun Sa was not a criminal in hiding. He held press conferences, gave interviews to Western journalists, and portrayed himself as a freedom fighter for the Shan people, a man forced into the drug trade by the refusal of the Burmese government to grant his people autonomy. The heroin that flowed out of the Golden Triangle in the 1970s and 80s found eager markets. In the United States, the purity and availability of heroin had recovered from the disruption of the French connection. But it was in Asia and Australia where the impact was most immediate. Australian cities saw a surge in overdoses. European cities became distribution hubs. The Golden Triangle had filled the void left by the Sicilians. But by the 1990s, Khun Sa's empire was under pressure. The Thai government, under US pressure, launched military operations against his strongholds. In 1996, Khun Sa, aging and perhaps sensing the futility of endless war, negotiated a surrender to the Burmese government. He lived out his final years in Yangon in relative comfort, his past seemingly forgiven. The Golden Triangle's dominance began to wane, but the opium poppies continued to grow. Because by then, a new and even more formidable source of heroin had emerged, one born from the ashes of empires and the chaos of war, a place where opium had been cultivated for thousands of years and where the collapse of order would allow it to flourish on an unprecedented scale. That place was Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a graveyard of empires. The British learned this in the 19th century, the Soviets learned it in the 1980s, and the Americans would learn it in the 21st. But long before any of these powers arrived, the opium poppy was growing in Afghanistan's valleys. The climate was perfect. Cold winters, hot summers, and high altitudes that produced a particularly potent resin. For centuries, Afghan farmers had grown small plots of opium, used locally and traded along the Silk Road. It was never the country's dominant crop. That honour belonged to wheat, pomegranates, and grapes. Everything changed in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The war that followed was brutal and chaotic. The Afghan Mujahideen, a fractious collection of tribal militias and Islamist fighters, waged a guerrilla war against the Soviet occupiers. The CIA, in one of the largest covert operations in its history, funneled billions of dollars in weapons and support to the Mujahideen through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. The goal was simple: bleed the Soviets, turn Afghanistan into their Vietnam. In the chaos of war, opium cultivation exploded. Farmers whose fields had been destroyed, whose villages had been bombed, turned to the one crop that was easy to grow, easy to transport, and highly profitable. The Mujahideen commanders needed money to buy weapons, to pay soldiers, to sustain the fight. They turned to opium, they taxed the farmers, they protected the smugglers. Some commanders operated their own refineries. The ISI, the CIA's primary partner, was deeply complicit. Pakistani military officers and intelligence agents facilitated the trade, taking their cut, and allowing the heroin to flow through Pakistan to markets in Europe and the West. By the time the Soviets withdrew in 1989, Afghanistan was the world's leading producer of opium, and the country descended into a brutal civil war between rival Mujahideen factions. Warlords carved out fiefdoms, and opium was the currency of power. Villages that refused to grow poppies were destroyed. The fields of Helmand province, the fertile river valleys, turned into endless seas of white and purple poppy flowers. Then, in the mid-1990s, a new force emerged from the madrasas of Pakistan, the Taliban. They were religious zealots, puritanical students of Islam who promised order in a land consumed by chaos. They swept across Afghanistan, imposing a brutal interpretation of Sharia law. Music was banned, women were erased from public life, and thieves had their hands cut off in public squares. The world watched in horror. But on the question of opium, the Taliban's position was complex. Initially, they condemned it as un-Islamic, but they also recognized its economic necessity. Afghanistan's economy ran on opium. Farmers depended on it. Traders depended on it. So the Taliban imposed a tax, a 20% levy on all opium produced in the territories they controlled. They called it zakat, a religious tithe. The revenue funded their war effort. By 2000, Afghanistan was producing 70% of the world's opium. The fields of Helmand province alone yielded thousands of tons. Under international pressure, and in a move that shocked everyone, the Taliban's leader, Mullah Omar, issued a decree in July 2000 banning opium cultivation entirely. It was one of the most effective drug prohibition efforts in history. Enforced by the brutal efficiency of the Taliban's religious police, opium production in Afghanistan dropped by over 90% in a single year. The poppy fields lay fallow, but the ban was short-lived. In October 2001, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, the United States invaded Afghanistan, toppling the Taliban regime in a matter of weeks. The warlords, many of whom had been sidelined by the Taliban, returned to power under the protection of American and NATO forces, and with them came the poppies. The American military, focused on hunting al-Qaeda and fighting a resurgent Taliban insurgency, made a calculated decision. Do not antagonize the local population or the regional strongmen by destroying their opium crops. Afghan President Hamid Karzai's own brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, was widely reported to be deeply involved in the opium trade, allegedly under the protection of the CIA. The logic was cynical but clear. We need allies in this war, and if those allies profit from opium, so be it. Opium cultivation skyrocketed. By 2007, Afghanistan was producing 93% of the world's opium, over 8,000 tons a year. The fields of Helmand province were more valuable than the entire GDP of some small nations. The money flowed in every direction. Farmers sold to traders, traders sold to refiners, often operating in primitive labs in the desert or hidden in compounds. The morphine base and heroin were smuggled out through Pakistan, Iran, and the Central Asian republics, destined for Russia, Europe, and increasingly the United States. The Taliban, now an insurgency, saw the opportunity. They reversed their ban and once again imposed taxes on the poppy crop. Some estimates suggest that at the height of the war, the Taliban earned $100 to $200 million a year from the opium trade, money that bought weapons, paid fighters, and sustained their war against NATO forces. The American taxpayer was funding a war against an insurgency that was, in part, funded by opium grown in fields that American policy refused to destroy. For 20 years, this perverse arrangement continued. Afghanistan remained the world's narco state, and the heroin flowing out of it fueled epidemics across the globe. In Russia, heroin addiction devastated a generation. In Europe, Afghan heroin became the dominant supply, and in the United States it quietly began to seep back into the cities and small towns, especially after the mid-2000s when another crisis was about to create a massive new pool of opioid users. The modern opioid crisis in the United States did not begin with heroin. It began with a lie told by a pharmaceutical company. That company was Purdue Pharma, and the lie was about a drug called OxyContin. In the early 1990s, there was a movement within medicine to treat pain more aggressively. Pain, advocates argued, was undertreated. Patients with chronic pain, cancer pain, post-surgical pain were suffering needlessly because doctors were too afraid to prescribe opioids. Organizations like the American Pain Society began pushing for pain to be treated as the fifth vital sign, something to be assessed and addressed at every medical visit. It was a compassionate idea, rooted in real suffering. Purdue Pharma saw an opportunity. In 1996, they launched OxyContin, a time-release formulation of oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid. The drug was designed to release slowly over 12 hours, providing steady pain relief. But Purdue's marketing went far beyond that. They claimed, falsely, that the risk of addiction with OxyContin was less than 1%. They sent an army of sales representatives to doctors' offices, armed with misleading studies, free samples, and incentives. They targeted family doctors, general practitioners who had little training in pain management or addiction. They pushed high doses. They encouraged prescriptions for moderate pain, for chronic conditions, for anything and everything, and doctors prescribed it, in staggering numbers. By 2010, enough opioid prescriptions were being written in the United States to give every adult their own bottle of pills. The prescriptions were not just for cancer patients or people recovering from major surgery. They were for back pain, for dental work, for sports injuries. People who had never taken an opioid in their lives were given a 30-day supply of a powerful narcotic, and they got hooked. The time-release mechanism, it turned out, was easy to defeat. Crush the pill, and you release the full 12-hour dose at once. Snort it or dissolve it and inject it, and you had a heroin-like high. People who started with a legitimate prescription found themselves addicted. When the prescription ran out, they sought more. Some doctor shopped, visiting multiple physicians to get more pills. Others turned to the black market, where OxyContin and similar pills were sold for dollars per milligram. But pills are expensive on the street. An 80 ml OxyContin could cost $60 or $80. For someone taking multiple pills a day to stave off withdrawal, the cost became unsustainable, and so, inevitably, they turned to the cheaper alternative. They turned to heroin. Heroin, which had been a relatively niche drug in the United States since the 1970s, suddenly found a vast new market. But this was a different user base. These were not the inner-city addicts of previous generations. These were suburban teenagers, rural factory workers, middle-class parents. The opioid crisis was democratic in a way that previous drug epidemics had not been. It touched every community, every demographic, and the heroin itself had changed. The Mexican cartels, who had spent decades perfecting the cocaine trade, saw the opportunity and pivoted. They began producing heroin from opium poppies grown in the mountains of Guerrero, Sinaloa, and Durango. The cartels refined it into a form of heroin known as black tar, named for its dark, sticky appearance, or into a purer powdered form. They flooded the US market. The cartel's distribution networks were sophisticated. They didn't rely on street corners. They used a system of delivery services where users could call a number, place an order, and have heroin delivered to them like pizza. It was efficient, discreet, and terrifyingly effective. The purity of the heroin was higher than anything users were accustomed to, and overdose deaths began to climb. By 2010, heroin overdose deaths in the United States had doubled compared to the year 2000. By 2015, they had quintupled. And then, just as the heroin crisis was reaching a terrible peak, something even worse arrived. Fentanyl. Fentanyl is not derived from the poppy. It is a purely synthetic opioid, created in a laboratory by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen in 1960. It was intended for use in surgery and for managing severe pain in cancer patients. It is, by weight, 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. A dose the size of a few grains of salt can be lethal. For decades, fentanyl remained in the medical realm, administered in controlled settings. But in the 2010s, it began to appear on the black market. The Mexican cartels and Chinese chemical suppliers discovered that fentanyl and its analogues could be synthesized cheaply from precursor chemicals. It required no poppy fields, no weather-dependent harvests, no complex refining. A small lab could produce kilograms of fentanyl from chemicals ordered online. The economics were irresistible. A kilogram of fentanyl could be purchased for a few $1,000s and could be used to create hundreds of thousands of doses. It could be mixed with heroin to increase potency or to stretch supply. It could be pressed into counterfeit pills that looked identical to prescription opioids. The profit margins were astronomical. But fentanyl is almost impossible to dose safely outside of a medical setting. Its potency means that the difference between a dose that produces a high and a dose that stops your breathing is vanishingly small. And because it is mixed into heroin by street-level dealers with no precision, no quality control, users never know what they're getting. One batch might be weak, the next might be lethal. The result was a slaughter. Overdose deaths in the United States, which had been climbing steadily, suddenly exploded. In 2015, there were about 33,000 opioid overdose deaths. By 2017, that number was over 47,000. By 2021, it exceeded 80,000. The majority involved fentanyl. The heroin user who thought they knew how much they could safely use took their usual dose and died. The person who bought what they thought was a Percocet or a Xanax on the street was actually getting a counterfeit pill pressed with fentanyl and died. The crisis is ongoing. Entire communities have been devastated. In small towns across Appalachia, the Rust Belt, New England, there are families where every member has lost someone to an overdose. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed. Narcan, the opioid overdose reversal drug, is carried by police, firefighters, librarians, and ordinary citizens. The death toll surpasses that of the Vietnam War, of car accidents, of gun violence. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, a plague of despair, and it all traces back to a flower cultivated in the mountains of Afghanistan, refined in labs in Mexico, distributed by cartels, prescribed by doctors, and consumed by millions of people seeking relief, escape, or oblivion. Let us take stock of what this molecule has wrought. Let us look unflinchingly at the true cost of heroin. Because the devastation is not abstract, it is etched into flesh, into communities, into the very soil of the earth. First, there is the human cost, and it is beyond comprehension. We measure it in the dead. Over 1 million Americans have died from opioid overdoses since the late 1990s. 1 million. That is more than all the Americans who died in every war since World War II combined. Each one of those deaths is a person, a son, a daughter, a parent, a friend. Each one is a moment of terror, of loneliness, of gasping for breath that will not come. Most die alone, in a bathroom, in a car, in a cheap motel room. By the time someone finds them, their lips are blue, their skin cold. But the dead are only part of the story. For every person who dies, there are dozens more who survive, trapped in the grinding hell of addiction. Heroin addiction is not a moral failing. It is a hijacking of the brain's reward system. The drug floods the brain with dopamine, creating a euphoria that the brain remembers as the most important thing that has ever happened. And when the drug is gone, the brain screams for it. Withdrawal is agony, muscle cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, sweating, shaking, a feeling of impending death, and it lasts for days. To avoid this, the addict will do anything. They will steal from their families, prostitute themselves, commit crimes they would never have imagined. The drug becomes the only thing that matters. Relationships disintegrate. Jobs are lost. Homes are abandoned. The person they were disappears, replaced by a desperate singular need. And then there are the children. The collateral damage. Children born to mothers using heroin during pregnancy suffer from neonatal abstinence syndrome. Their tiny bodies going through withdrawal in the first days of life. They tremble. They cry inconsolably. They struggle to eat. Many of these children are removed from their parents by child protective services, entering a foster care system that is overwhelmed. An entire generation is growing up in the shadow of this crisis, traumatized, neglected, inheriting the wounds of their parents. The geographic cost is equally stark. Entire regions have been hollowed out. In towns across West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, the opioid crisis has compounded decades of economic decline. Factories closed, coal mines shut down, the jobs that once sustained these communities are gone, and heroin rushed in to fill the void. Main streets are lined with shuttered storefronts. The population is aging and dying. Young people, the ones who can, leave. The ones who stay often fall into the drug. These towns have become landscapes of despair. The overdose rate in some counties is so high that the local funeral homes cannot keep up. The morgues are full. Families, already struggling, are bankrupted by funeral costs. In some places, life expectancy has declined, a statistic almost unheard of in the developed world. This is not supposed to happen. In wealthy nations, people are supposed to live longer with each generation. But in the heart of America, they are dying younger. The cost to the medical system is staggering. Hospitals spend billions treating overdoses, infections from dirty needles, and the complications of long-term opioid use: endocarditis, collapsed veins, abscesses, hepatitis C, HIV. Emergency departments in hard-hit areas see the same people again and again, revived with Narcan, only to return days later. Doctors and nurses, already overworked, are burning out, exhausted by the futility of treating a crisis that never ends. There is a cost, too, in the criminal justice system. Prisons are filled with people whose only crime was possession of heroin or theft to support their habit. Mandatory minimum sentences, enacted in the tough-on-crime era of the 1980s and 90s, sent non-violent drug offenders away for decades. Families were separated, children grew up without parents. And upon release, these individuals returned to communities with even fewer opportunities. A criminal record ensuring they would remain on the margins, increasing the likelihood they would use again. The international cost is no less devastating. In Afghanistan, the opium trade has sustained a war that has killed hundreds of thousands. Farmers who cultivate poppies do so not out of choice but out of necessity. Wheat yields a few $100s per hectare. Opium yields several thousand. For a farmer with a family to feed in a country where the average income is less than $2 a day, the choice is not a choice at all. But the money from opium does not stay with the farmers. It flows to the Taliban, to corrupt officials, to warlords. It perpetuates violence and instability. In Mexico, the heroin trade has fueled a conflict that resembles civil war. Since 2006, when the Mexican government launched its militarized campaign against the cartels, over 350,000 people have been killed. Not all of these deaths are related to heroin. Many involve cocaine, methamphetamine, and other drugs. But the heroin trade has been a significant part of the cartel's portfolios, and the violence it has generated is unrelenting. Journalists are murdered for reporting on the cartels. Mayors and police chiefs are assassinated. Entire towns are held hostage by armed groups. Mass graves are discovered in the deserts, filled with the bodies of the disappeared. The environmental cost is also profound, though less visible. In the mountains of Mexico, forests are cleared to plant opium poppies. The chemicals used to refine the opium into heroin, acetic anhydride, lime, ammonia, are dumped into streams and rivers, poisoning water supplies and killing wildlife. In Afghanistan, the same story plays out. The opium economy has no regard for sustainability, for the land, for the future. It is extractive in the most brutal sense. And then there is the existential cost, the one that is hardest to quantify. Heroin has stolen hope. It has robbed communities of their future. It has turned the promise of relief from suffering into a gateway to oblivion. It has revealed the darkest aspects of capitalism, the way a product can be marketed, distributed, and consumed with no regard for the human cost, as long as there is profit to be made. The pharmaceutical companies that pushed opioids knew they were addictive. Internal documents from Purdue Pharma, revealed in lawsuits, show that executives were aware of the abuse potential and the rising addiction rates. They did not care. They paid bonuses to sales reps who pushed doctors to prescribe higher doses. They funded front groups that advocated for aggressive pain treatment with opioids. They made billions of dollars, and when the reckoning came, they declared bankruptcy, shielded their personal fortunes, and walked away. The Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, were among the wealthiest families in America. Their name was on museum wings, on university buildings. That blood money bought respectability. Some of those institutions have since removed the Sackler name, but the damage is done. The pills were already in the bottles. The addiction had already taken hold. The heroin trade, both the pharmaceutical-grade opioids and the illicit powder, is a monument to human greed and human suffering intertwined. It is a reminder that the line between medicine and poison is not drawn by chemistry but by intent, by regulation, by the choices of those who profit and those who govern. So where are we now? What is the state of heroin and the opioid crisis as we move deeper into the 21st century? The answer is grim, but it is not without glimmers of hope, or at least of pragmatic adaptation. In the United States, the crisis continues, but its nature has shifted once again. Heroin use has been largely eclipsed by fentanyl. Many users do not even seek out heroin anymore. They seek fentanyl because it is stronger, because it is what is available. The drug supply has become a toxic lottery. Pills pressed in clandestine labs, powders mixed by dealers with no training, no equipment, no care. Every use is a gamble. The government response has been multifaceted, though many argue it is far too little, far too late. Naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, is now widely available. Many states have passed Good Samaritan laws which protect people who call 911 during an overdose from prosecution. Needle exchange programs, once controversial, are now recognized as essential harm reduction tools, preventing the spread of HIV and hepatitis C. There has been a slow, painful shift in how addiction is viewed, at least in some quarters. It is increasingly recognized as a medical condition, not a moral failing. Medication-assisted treatment, using drugs like methadone, buprenorphine, or naltrexone to manage cravings and withdrawal, has been shown to save lives. But access to these treatments is still limited, especially in rural areas. The stigma remains, insurance companies often refuse to cover long-term treatment, and the demand far outstrips the supply of services. Some jurisdictions have gone further. In Canada, several cities have opened supervised injection sites, places where people can use drugs under medical supervision, with clean equipment and immediate access to overdose reversal. The data shows these sites save lives, reduce disease transmission, and connect people to treatment. But they are politically controversial, opposed by those who see them as enabling addiction. In Portugal, which decriminalized all drugs in 2001, the approach has been to treat drug use as a public health issue, not a criminal one. People caught with small amounts of drugs are referred to counseling and treatment, not jail. The results, by most measures, have been positive. Drug use rates have not skyrocketed as opponents feared. Overdose deaths have declined. HIV infection rates have plummeted. It is a model that challenges the American instinct to punish. But even with these efforts, the crisis grinds on. Fentanyl is now being mixed into other drugs: cocaine, methamphetamine, even marijuana. Users who have never touched an opioid are dying from fentanyl poisoning. The death toll continues to climb. In 2023, the CDC reported that opioid overdose deaths remained near record highs, with over 80,000 Americans dying in a single year. Internationally, the picture is complex. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, after regaining control of the country in 2021 following the American withdrawal, once again banned opium cultivation in April 2022. Early reports suggest the ban has been brutally effective, with poppy cultivation dropping by an estimated 95%. But this has created a humanitarian crisis. Farmers have no alternative crop that can generate the same income. Many are destitute, and the global heroin supply, which was overwhelmingly Afghan, has been disrupted. Some experts predict this will lead to increased prices, potentially reducing use. Others fear it will drive more users to fentanyl, which requires no poppies at all. In Mexico, the cartels continue to produce heroin, though fentanyl has become their primary export. The violence has not abated. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's policy of hugs, not bullets, a strategy of non-confrontation with the cartels, has been criticized as ineffective. The cartels are more powerful than ever, controlling vast territories and operating with near impunity. In Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle has seen a resurgence, not of heroin, but of methamphetamine production. The same criminal networks, the same remote labs, have simply shifted to a different product. But heroin production continues, though on a smaller scale than in decades past, feeding regional markets. The story of heroin, then, is not over. It is ongoing, evolving, adapting. The drug that was created as a miracle cure in 1898 is, over a century later, one of the deadliest substances on Earth. Its legacy is written in gravestones, in shattered families, in poisoned rivers, in destabilized nations. It is a legacy that stretches from the poppy fields of ancient Mesopotamia to the fentanyl labs of modern China. It is a legacy of pain, of greed, of the eternal human search for relief, and the terrible price of that search. There are lessons here, if we are willing to see them. The first is that prohibition alone does not work. For over a century, governments have waged war on heroin, on opium, on opioids. They have banned it, criminalized it, militarized the response, and yet the drug persists. The demand persists. As long as there is suffering, as long as there is despair, as long as there is a desire to escape the unbearable weight of consciousness, people will seek out substances that offer relief. Prohibition does not eliminate that demand. It simply ensures that the supply is controlled by criminals, that the product is unregulated, that the use is driven underground where help cannot reach. The second lesson is that the pharmaceutical industry, left to its own devices, will prioritize profit over human life. The opioid crisis was not an accident. It was the result of deliberate decisions made by executives who knew the risks and chose to ignore them. Regulation is not an impediment to medicine, it is a safeguard. And when regulators are captured by the industries they are meant to oversee, when profit margins dictate policy, the result is catastrophe. The third lesson is that addiction is not a moral failure. It is a medical condition, one that is treatable. The instinct to punish, to incarcerate, to shame people who use drugs has not worked. It has never worked. What works is treatment, is compassion, is recognizing that the person in the grip of addiction is still a person, still deserving of dignity and help. And the fourth lesson, perhaps the most difficult, is that the roots of the opioid crisis lie not just in the drug, but in the conditions that make people vulnerable to it. The economic despair of deindustrialized towns, the trauma of war, of abuse, of neglect, the loneliness and alienation of modern life. Heroin does not create these problems, it exploits them. It offers a chemical solution to spiritual and social crises, and until we address those underlying conditions, until we rebuild the communities that have been hollowed out, until we offer people a reason to hope, the demand for heroin and drugs like it will remain. The poppy flower is beautiful. Its petals are delicate, its bloom brief. But from it flows a resin that has caused more suffering than almost any other substance in human history. It has been called many things: the joy plant, the milk of paradise, medicine, poison, miracle, curse. All of these are true. Heroin is all of these things depending on the dose, the context, the intent. In 1898, when Bayer launched heroin to the world, they believed they had tamed the poppy. They believed they had created a drug that could heal without harming. It was a lie, but it was a lie born of genuine hope, of the faith that science could perfect nature, that chemistry could deliver us from pain without cost. That faith was misplaced. There is always a cost. We know that now. We have paid it, in full, in blood. The bill has come due in the overdose deaths of teenagers in suburban bedrooms, in the bodies of young men found in the alleys of American cities, in the fields of Afghanistan where farmers plant poppies because they have no other choice, in the violence that has consumed Mexico, in the HIV infections from shared needles, in the children born dependent, in the families torn apart, in the communities destroyed. Heroin's history is a mirror held up to our own failures. Our failure to regulate industry, our failure to treat the suffering among us with compassion, our failure to address inequality and despair, our failure to see that the war on drugs is, in so many ways, a war on the most vulnerable. The story of heroin is not the story of a molecule. It is the story of us, of what we are willing to do to each other in the name of profit, of what we are willing to do to ourselves in the name of escape. It is a story of empires and addicts, of chemists and cartels, of doctors and dealers. It is a story that begins with a flower and ends, for too many, in a grave. And it is not over. Even now, as you listen to this, someone is injecting heroin for the first time, convinced they can control it. Someone is taking their last breath, alone, in the dark, their body shutting down from an overdose. Someone is working in a lab, synthesizing the next generation of synthetic opioids, more potent, more profitable, more deadly. Someone is prescribing opioids to a patient in good faith, unaware they are lighting a fuse. And someone is planting poppy seeds in a field, because they have no other way to feed their family. The cycle continues. The flower blooms, the resin weeps, the powder is refined, the drug is sold, the user seeks relief. And the world keeps turning, indifferent to the suffering that this simple molecule has wrought. In the end, heroin is a reminder of a fundamental truth, that the line between medicine and poison, between healing and harm, is thinner than we would like to believe, that the substances we create to alleviate suffering can become the source of even greater suffering, and that the real epidemic is not the drug itself, but the pain, the hopelessness, the disconnection that drives people to seek it out. Heroin was supposed to be a miracle, a gift from science to humanity, a way to end pain without the dangers of morphine. It was supposed to be better. Instead, it became one of the most destructive forces in modern history, a testament to hubris, a monument to greed, a legacy written in the bodies of the dead, the miracle that medicine created, the miracle that medicine came to regret, the miracle that the world wishes it could forget but never will, because the dead do not forget, and neither should we. The question that haunts us, the question that should haunt us, is this: could it have been different? Could we have seen this coming? The answer is yes. At every turn, there were warnings. There were people who understood the danger, but they were ignored, dismissed, or silenced by those who had too much to gain from selling the dream. When Bayer first marketed heroin, there were physicians who raised concerns about its addictive potential. They were told they were being overly cautious, that the scientific evidence was clear. When the first wave of heroin addiction swept through America in the 1910s and 20s, public health officials called for treatment and education. They were drowned out by the prohibitionists who insisted that law enforcement was the only answer. When the French Connection was dismantled in the 1970s, DEA agents warned that shutting down one supply route would simply open others. They were right, but the political imperative was to declare victory, not to prepare for the next phase of the war. When the CA supported anti-communist forces in Southeast Asia and Afghanistan, operatives on the ground reported that these allies were deeply involved in opium trafficking. The reports were filed away, classified, ignored. The Cold War mattered more than the drug war. When Purdue Pharma began its aggressive marketing of OxyContin in the 1990s, addiction specialists warned that prescribing opioids for chronic pain was dangerous. They were accused of wanting patients to suffer, of standing in the way of compassionate care. When doctors in rural communities began seeing patients who were clearly addicted to prescription opioids, they reported it to state medical boards, to the DEA. The response was slow, bureaucratic, insufficient. By the time regulators acted, millions were already addicted. And when the first deaths from fentanyl-contaminated heroin began appearing in coroner's reports in 2013 and 2014, public health officials sounded alarms. They called for expanded access to naloxone, for supervised injection sites, for a massive investment in treatment. They were told there was no money, no political will. The crisis was seen as a problem of personal responsibility, not public health. People made bad choices, the thinking went, and they would have to live or die with the consequences. At every step, profit and ideology trumped evidence and compassion. The result is the world we live in now, where a grandmother in Ohio can die from a fentanyl-laced pill she thought was a legitimate Percocet purchased online, where a teenager in British Columbia can overdose at a party from cocaine cut with carfentanil, an opioid used to tranquilize elephants, and where entire regions of the United States have become sacrifice zones, places where the social fabric has been so thoroughly shredded by opioids that recovery seems impossible. Let us turn, for a moment, to the voices of those who have lived through this, because behind every statistic, every graph showing rising overdose deaths, there is a human being with a story. There is the single mother in West Virginia who started taking Vicodin after a car accident, who found that it didn't just ease her pain but also quieted the anxiety that had plagued her for years. When her prescription ran out, she found a dealer. When the pills became too expensive, she switched to heroin. She lost custody of her children. She lived in her car. She overdosed 3 times before finally getting into treatment. She has been clean for 2 years now, working at a gas station, seeing her children on supervised visits, rebuilding a life from rubble. There is the veteran who came back from Afghanistan with PTSD and chronic pain from an IED blast. The VA prescribed him opioids. He took them as directed, but the dose kept increasing. When he tried to stop, the withdrawal was unbearable. He started buying pills on the street, then heroin. He tried to get treatment, but the waiting list was 6 months long. He overdosed in the parking lot of the VA hospital waiting for an appointment. He survived, but the friend who found him, a fellow veteran, did not survive his own overdose 2 months later. There is the high school athlete who blew out his knee, who was given a prescription for OxyContin by a well-meaning orthopedist. He liked the way it made him feel, not just physically, but emotionally. It smoothed out the rough edges of adolescence, made him confident, made him care less about the college scholarships he had lost. He started crushing and snorting the pills. Within a year, he was injecting heroin. His parents found him unconscious in the bathroom, blue-lipped and not breathing. They revived him with naloxone, got him into rehab. He relapsed twice, but has now been sober for 5 years. He speaks at high schools, telling his story, warning kids about the path he took. There is the young woman who grew up in a home where addiction was already present, where her father drank and her mother was hooked on pain pills. She started using heroin at 16, a boyfriend's idea, a way to fit in. She spent her 20s in a blur of using, overdosing, reviving, using again. She lost teeth, she contracted hepatitis C, she was raped more than once while too high to fight back. She has been in and out of jail, in and out of treatment. She's now on methadone, stable for the first time in years, working on her GED, hoping to become a peer counsellor to help others like her. These are not outliers. These are the faces of the opioid crisis. Ordinary people from every walk of life who encountered a drug at a vulnerable moment and found themselves trapped. Some escape, many do not. And the dead cannot tell their stories. The cultural impact of heroin extends beyond the immediate crisis. It has reshaped how we think about addiction, about pain, about the role of medicine in society. There is a profound loss of trust. Patients no longer trust that their doctors have their best interests at heart. They have seen too many stories of physicians who overprescribed, who took kickbacks from pharmaceutical companies, who dismissed concerns about addiction. The doctor-patient relationship, once sacred, has been poisoned. There is also a loss of trust in institutions. The FDA approved OxyContin with a label that downplayed its addiction risk. The DEA, which is supposed to regulate the pharmaceutical industry's production of opioids, allowed production quotas to skyrocket in the 2000s, even as addiction rates soared. Congress, lobbied heavily by pharmaceutical companies, was slow to act. When the crisis could no longer be ignored, when it began affecting white suburban and rural communities in large numbers, suddenly there was a bipartisan consensus that this was a public health emergency. But the help came too late for many, and it came with too little funding, too little urgency. The opioid crisis has also forced a reckoning with how we think about pain itself. For centuries, pain was seen as an inevitable part of the human condition, something to be endured. The 20th century, with its development of powerful analgesics, promised to eliminate pain, and for a time, that seemed like an unalloyed good. But we have learned, painfully, that there is a cost to this promise. Not all pain can be eliminated, and the attempt to eliminate it with opioids often creates a new kind of suffering. There is now a growing movement toward alternative pain management: physical therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, acupuncture, mindfulness, non-opioid medications. These approaches are not as immediate, not as dramatic as the relief offered by an opioid. They require time, effort, a willingness to live with some degree of discomfort, but they do not carry the risk of addiction and death. The crisis has also sparked a conversation about the nature of addiction itself. For too long, addiction was seen as a failure of character, a lack of willpower. We now understand that it is a chronic disease of the brain, one that changes the neural circuitry related to reward, motivation, and memory. The person who is addicted is not weak. They are sick, and like any other disease, addiction requires treatment, not punishment. This shift in understanding has been slow and uneven. In some places it has led to real change: expanded access to medication-assisted treatment, needle exchanges, overdose prevention sites. In other places, the old moralism persists. Addicts are still seen as criminals, as drains on society, as undeserving of help. This dichotomy reflects a deeper tension in how we think about suffering, about who is deserving of compassion and who is not. Let us also consider the role of heroin in popular culture, because the drug has always had a strange, dark glamour. In the 1960s and 70s, it was the drug of rock stars and rebels. Lou Reed sang about heroin, a song that captured both the seduction and the horror of the drug. The Velvet Underground's music was inseparable from the heroin that flowed through the factory scene of Andy Warhol's New York. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, these icons of the counterculture all struggled with opioids and other drugs, and their early deaths became part of their legend. In literature, heroin has been both subject and muse. William S. Burroughs wrote Junkie and Naked Lunch, raw, hallucinatory accounts of addiction that stripped away any romanticism and revealed the drug for what it was, a parasitic need. Hubert Selby Jr.'s Requiem for a Dream depicted addiction as a descent into hell, each character's trajectory more devastating than the last. Irvine Welsh's Trainspotting gave voice to a generation of heroin users in Edinburgh, showing the bleak humour and desperate camaraderie of life on the margins. In film, heroin has been portrayed with varying degrees of realism and sensationalism. The Panic in Needle Park, Drugstore Cowboy, Trainspotting, Requiem for a Dream. These films did not glamorize heroin. They showed it as it is, a trap, a slow death, a life reduced to the singular pursuit of the next fix. Yet even in their bleakness there is a fascination, a voyeuristic pull. The viewer is horrified but cannot look away. This cultural presence has had a dual effect. On one hand, it has helped to demystify addiction, to show it as a human experience rather than an abstract moral failing. On the other hand, it has perpetuated certain myths. The tortured artist who needs drugs to create, the rebel who uses heroin as an act of defiance against a conformist society. These myths are seductive, but they are lies. Heroin does not make you more creative. It does not make you more authentic. It makes you a slave to a chemical. The global dimensions of the heroin trade continue to evolve in ways that are both predictable and surprising. As Afghan production has been disrupted by the Taliban's 2022 ban, there has been a scramble to fill the gap. Some of this has been filled by increased production in Myanmar, where ethnic armed groups in the Shan state have ramped up opium cultivation. Some has been filled by Mexico, where the cartels have expanded their poppy fields in the mountains of Guerrero and Nayarit. But increasingly, the future of the opioid trade is synthetic. Fentanyl requires no fields, no farmers, no seasons. It can be produced year-round in a small lab with precursor chemicals that are easily obtained. The Chinese government, under pressure from the United States, has cracked down on fentanyl production, scheduling many fentanyl analogues and precursors. But the chemical industry is always a step ahead. New analogues are created, slight modifications to the molecular structure that are not yet illegal. The precursors are shipped to Mexico, where the cartels have built sophisticated labs to produce fentanyl by the ton. The result is a global market that is more volatile, more dangerous, and more difficult to police than ever before. The old strategies, interdiction at borders, eradication of crops, arrests of kingpins, these are largely ineffective against synthetic opioids. The supply is too diffuse, the production too easy, the profit margins too high. Some experts are now calling for a radically different approach: legalization and regulation. The idea is that if opioids were legally available, produced to pharmaceutical standards, and distributed through regulated channels, the illegal market would collapse. Users would know what they were getting, the risk of contamination with fentanyl would disappear, and the vast criminal enterprises that profit from prohibition would be defunded. This is, to put it mildly, a controversial proposal. Critics argue that it would lead to increased addiction, that it would send a message that drug use is acceptable, that it would be a surrender in the war on drugs. Proponents argue that the war on drugs has already been lost, that prohibition has caused more harm than the drugs themselves, and that a regulated market, combined with robust treatment and harm reduction services, would save lives. Countries like Switzerland have experimented with heroin-assisted treatment, where long-term addicts who have failed other treatments are prescribed pharmaceutical-grade heroin in supervised clinical settings. The results have been promising: reduced crime, improved health outcomes, increased social stability. But these programs are small, tightly controlled, and politically difficult to expand. The truth is that there is no easy answer. Heroin and synthetic opioids present a challenge that cuts across medicine, law enforcement, public health, economics, and ethics. Every solution has trade-offs. Every policy has unintended consequences. But what is clear is that the status quo is unacceptable. The death toll is too high. The suffering is too widespread. Something must change. As we look to the future, several things are certain. First, the demand for opioids will not disappear. As long as there is pain, physical and emotional, as long as there is despair and disconnection, people will seek substances that offer relief or escape. This is a fundamental aspect of the human condition. We have been using psychoactive substances for tens of thousands of years, and we will continue to do so. Second, the supply will continue to adapt. If Afghanistan is taken off the board, production will shift elsewhere. If heroin becomes scarce, synthetic opioids will fill the gap. The market is ruthlessly efficient. Where there is demand and profit, there will be supply. Third, the crisis will continue to evolve in ways we cannot fully predict. New synthetic opioids are being developed, some of them thousands of times more potent than morphine. Carfentanil, an opioid used to tranquilize large animals, has already appeared in the drug supply. A dose measured in micrograms can be lethal. The accidental exposure of first responders and law enforcement to these substances is a growing concern. We are entering an era where the drugs themselves are so potent that even indirect contact can be dangerous. Fourth, the burden of the crisis will continue to fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable. The wealthy can afford private rehab facilities, concierge medicine, second chances. The poor cannot. They are more likely to encounter contaminated drugs, less likely to have access to treatment, more likely to be incarcerated rather than treated, more likely to die. The opioid crisis is, in many ways, a crisis of inequality. And fifth, The legacy of this crisis will endure for generations. The children growing up in homes ravaged by addiction, the communities hollowed out by overdose deaths, the trust in institutions that has been shattered, these scars will not heal quickly. We are living through a historic trauma, one that will shape our society for decades to come. So what is to be done? If there is any hope, it lies in a few basic principles. First, we must treat addiction as a health issue, not a criminal issue. This means expanding access to evidence-based treatment, including medication-assisted treatment. It means removing the stigma that prevents people from seeking help. It means ensuring that no one dies because they were afraid to call for help during an overdose. Second, we must embrace harm reduction. This means widespread distribution of naloxone, the overdose reversal drug. It means needle exchanges to prevent the spread of infectious disease. It means, in some places, supervised injection sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision. These measures do not encourage drug use, they save lives. And a person who is alive can eventually get into recovery. A person who is dead cannot. Third, we must address the root causes of addiction: trauma, poverty, isolation, lack of opportunity. This is the hardest work, the work that requires not just funding, but a fundamental reimagining of how we structure our society. It means investing in education, in mental health services, in economic development in struggling regions. It means rebuilding the social connections that have been frayed by decades of economic and cultural change. Fourth, we must hold accountable those who profited from this crisis. The Sackler family and Purdue Pharma are not the only culprits, but they are the most visible. Lawsuits and settlements have begun to extract some measure of justice, but it is not enough. The pharmaceutical industry must be regulated more strictly. The revolving door between industry and regulators must be closed. The profit motive must be balanced against the public good. And fifth, we must remember. We must remember the dead. We must remember how we got here. We must remember that this crisis was not inevitable, that it was the result of choices made by people in positions of power, people who valued profit over human life. If we forget, we will repeat these mistakes. We will create the next crisis with the next miracle drug, and the next generation will pay the price. Heroin is a molecule, nothing more. It is a specific arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen atoms, C21 3NO5. It has no moral dimension. It is not evil. It is not cursed. It is simply a chemical that interacts with receptors in the human brain in a particular way, producing effects that humans find desirable and ultimately destructive. But the story of heroin is not a story of chemistry. It is a story of humanity. It is a story of our endless capacity for self-deception, our willingness to believe that this time will be different, that we have found the solution without the cost. It is a story of greed, of the willingness to profit from the suffering of others. It is a story of desperation, of people seeking escape from lives that have become unbearable. And it is a story of compassion, of the people who, despite everything, continue to fight for those caught in addiction's grip, who see the humanity in the addict, who refuse to give up. In 1898, when the chemists at Bayer first synthesized diacetylmorphine and gave it the brand name heroin, they believed they were making the world a better place. They believed they had conquered pain without the risk of addiction. They were wrong, catastrophically, tragically wrong. The miracle they created became a curse that has claimed millions of lives and shows no sign of abating. If there is a lesson in this, it is humility. It is the recognition that we do not fully understand the systems we are manipulating, whether those systems are chemical, biological, or social. It is the understanding that every action has consequences, often unintended, and that the pursuit of profit or progress without regard for those consequences is a path to disaster. The poppy still grows. In the mountains of Mexico, in the valleys of Myanmar, in the hidden fields of Tasmania where pharmaceutical companies legally cultivate it for medical use. The flower is still beautiful. The resin still weeps from the scored pods, and from that resin, through a series of chemical transformations, We still produce the substances that kill more people than car accidents, than homicides, than many diseases. We could choose differently. We could choose to prioritize human life over profit. We could choose to treat pain and addiction with compassion and science rather than moralism and punishment. We could choose to build a society where people do not need to seek oblivion because their lives are bearable, even hopeful, but that would require a collective act of will that seems, at this moment, beyond us. And so the crisis continues, the overdoses continue, the deaths continue, and somewhere a person is taking their first dose of an opioid, prescribed by a well-meaning doctor or offered by a friend, with no idea that they are stepping onto a path that may end in their own grave. Heroin was supposed to be a miracle. Instead, it became one of the greatest disasters in the history of medicine, a monument to hubris, a testament to greed, a warning, unheeded, about the costs of our choices, the miracle that medicine regretted inventing, but which the world will live with and die with for the foreseeable future. This is its story. This is our story, and it is not over.